Recently, when I was on stage giving a keynote for an audience of women in the banking industry, I mentioned my age. Someone asked me an insightful question regarding a question that I've recently changed my opinion on. I thought about it for a moment, and then I turned to the audience and I declared, "I'm 54 years old and I'm still learning." I paused and I looked around. I distinctly remember noticing many encouraging smiles and nods from the audience. Interesting, right? Then later, several people came up to me and explicitly mentioned how impressed they were that I mentioned my age. Wow! The subtext here is clear. People rarely publicly declare the taboo topic of their age, particularly when they're old. After this recent experience, declaring my age in front of an audience, I decided to do some research and thinking about ageism. Up until now, as I've been preparing for this episode, otherwise I haven't really given ageism much thought. Perhaps I'm lucky because I'm a healthy 54-year-old. Also, because I run my own show. I'm personally responsible for creating the culture at Talk About Talk, where ageism is definitely not tolerated. But not everyone is so fortunate. Consider those aged 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 plus who are on the job market. Recently, I met such a job seeker. Let's call her Carla. Carla's a 57-year-old Caucasian female who's experienced ageism multiple times in her job search. Here's Carla.
One cannot prove that ageism is the problem or speak to the elephant in the room if one cannot get anywhere near being in the room. Try getting past an algorithm over age 40 these days and even getting an interview. Hashtag ageism on paper or hashtag digital ageism has us out of the running long before any now impossible interview. Recruiters won't bring us in because we're not a, quote, cultural fit. If we do manage to get an interview, the person interviewing us is generally 10, 15, or even 20 years younger. Even if things went as well as possible, they will not hire you knowing you will be taking direction from them or a similarly aged peer. Even if you're more than willing to be a junior, you were dismissed on site before the interview started. They're not comfortable with that scenario.
My recent conversation with Carla is just one of many that I've had with my clients about ageism. Also, racism and sexism and all the other isms for that matter. But I feel like ageism is being mentioned more and more lately. Or maybe it's just me because I'm old. Maybe. In my conversations with clients, they'll ask me things like, "Andrea, should I try to look younger? Should I try to talk younger? What words do those young folk use? Should I erase the years off my resume and my LinkedIn profile?" So here's the thing. Whether you're young or old or somewhere in between, whether you're looking for a new job or whether you're the CEO running your firm and responsible for your firm's culture, ageism is an important topic for all of us to be conscious of, whether it's your experience being affected by ageism or perhaps you're being ageist yourself. Let's talk ageism.
Let's do this. Let's talk about talk.
Welcome to Talk About Talk podcast episode number 160. In this episode, we're talking ageism. What ageism is, how it affects us, and I'm going to highlight 3 strategies for you to employ if you think you may be the victim of ageism, if you believe that you may be negatively impacted by your age. This is an important topic, whether you're the victim of ageism, whether you're an ally for others, or, as I said, whether you yourself might be ageist. Of course, as humans, we're constantly judging and evaluating each other. People look at how you're dressed, your posture, your tone of voice, your words. We make judgments, sometimes based on negative stereotypes that may result in discriminatory behaviors. We talk about the isms, including isms related to your height, your race, your gender, your sex, I could go on, and of course your age. Ageism, though, is an interesting ism. Typically, when we think about ageism, we think about discrimination against older people, don't we? But as you're about to learn, ageism also affects folks who are, quote unquote, too young. So, if you think about our lifespan then, we typically start out as too young, and then if we're lucky enough, we end up being too old. And I suppose that's the beautiful irony of ageism. Ultimately, the folks who are being ageist may very well end up being victimized by ageism as they too grow older. This is poetic justice. Before we go any further, let me introduce myself. In case we haven't met, my name is Dr. Andrea Wojnicki. Please call me Andrea. Yes, I'm 54 years old. I'm an executive communication coach at Talk About Talk, where I coach ambitious executives to improve their communication skills so they can communicate with confidence, clarity, and ultimately establish credibility. Recently, my team and I relaunched the whole talkabouttalk.com website. I really hope you'll go check it out. It's talkabouttalk.com. You'll find lots of resources for you there. Here's something new. At the bottom of the homepage, there are all sorts of free tip sheets and checklists that you can download to help you with your communication skills. Yes, they're free. You'll also find information on the website about my coaching, my speaking and workshops, and the email newsletter. That newsletter is your chance to get communication coaching from me every 2 weeks. Sound good? Please sign up at talkabouttalk.com. If you've been listening to the Talk About Talk podcast, you might know that while I cover all of the communication skills topics that you'd expect, like confidence and listening and storytelling, I am mildly obsessed with the topic of personal branding and establishing your ideal professional identity. It's a fundamental assumption of my executive coaching practice that we can shape and mold our communication skills and our professional identities. Certainly, we need to be authentic, but we have the opportunity to control the narrative around our respective personal brands. In my experience coaching thousands of executives, when we develop our personal brands in a disciplined and strategic way, we can get a lot of traction in terms of our career progression and our satisfaction. You may be wondering why I'm sharing this with you. Why the rant, Andrea, about personal branding? Well, I've been thinking a lot lately about how this topic of personal branding fits with age and ageism. Simply put, age is one of the many, many dimensions of your brand. And it's one that you have absolutely no control over, at least in terms of your chronological age. That is the amount of time that's lapsed from when you were born to now. Many of the elements in our respective personal brands you can control, at least to some extent. Consider your leadership style, your communication effectiveness, your work ethic, and how you show up. That said, there are dimensions of our personal brands where we have little or no choice in how we show up. Consider your childhood circumstances, your race, your geography, like where you grew up and maybe even where you live now. Sometimes we have very little choice about these things. And yes, your age is an important part of your personal brand. Even if you don't talk about your age, even if you don't flaunt it, even if you don't get up on stage in front of a big audience and declare, I am 54 years old, your age is still one element of your personal brand and your professional identity. So it's well worth your time to understand what ageism is, how it can affect you, and what you can do about it. Have you ever had any of these experiences? Think about this. Has someone ever told you that you look good for your age? Or has someone mentioned, I can't believe you're only 54 years old? Or when you look around your firm or your industry, do you notice that the prime, high visibility assignments are being awarded to younger folks as opposed to those with valuable experience? Or perhaps, like Carla, whom you heard from a few minutes ago, you were outright denied a job or a promotion simply because of your age. If you're listening to this from outside Canada, you may not have heard about the story of journalist Lisa Laflamme's experience. I'll leave a link to her story in the show notes. It's very fascinating. Laflamme was a highly regarded national news anchor here in Canada at CTV News. She was well respected with over 35 years of journalism experience. In the year 2022, she decided to let her dyed dark brown hair go to its natural gray. Then in August 2022, she was let go. She was terminated. Coincidence? The backlash was instant and strong at the grassroots level and at the formal institutional level. CTV's parent company, Bell Media, went on record saying that terminating La Flamme's contract after 35 years was a business decision, and they wanted to move her anchor role into a different direction. But then the head of Bell Media took a leave of absence. And there was a formal open letter that was signed by well-known and highly reputed politicians, business people, journalists, celebrities, and more, all supporting Lisa Laflamme and criticizing Bell Media and CTV. Notably, this open letter also identified that sexism played a role in the termination of Laflamme's contract. More on the intersectionality of ageism and sexism in a minute. My point in sharing Lisa Laflamme's high-profile story here is to illustrate that ageism is on our cultural radar. It's talked about in the media. So let's start by defining ageism. The term was coined in the late 1960s by American physician and gerontologist Dr. Neil Butler. Yes, gerontologist, as in geriatric. At the time, Dr. Butler was referring to the treatment of elderly people when he coined the term. Since then, though, ageism has evolved to also describe discrimination against younger people as well. Dr. Butler defined ageism as a combination of three things. 1, negative attitudes towards old age and the aging process. 2, discriminatory practices against older people. And 3, institutional practices and policies that perpetuate stereotypes about elderly people. This 3-point definition is important. It can help you identify ageism when you see it. This 3-point definition also reminds me of Ron Teit's Think, Do, Say framework from our last episode. Ageism includes what you think, what you do, and what you say. The thinking is the negative stereotypes. The doing is the discriminatory practices. And the saying is the institutionalization of these practices and policies. Research identifies several types of ageism. And note, these are not mutually exclusive, but they can be helpful in thinking about ageism that you experience or witness. Okay, so first, there's explicit and implicit ageism, depending on whether you're conscious of it or not. Benevolent ageism is where someone holds patronizing beliefs about age. Think, sweet old lady. Hostile ageism is having openly aggressive beliefs about age, such as teenagers are dangerous. There's interpersonal ageism, which, as you might imagine, occurs in social situations. Internalized ageism is focused on yourself, your beliefs about yourself. Yes, you can be ageist against yourself. And if this is you, just stop. Institutional ageism shows up in policies and actions. Okay, that's a lot of ageism. Yes, ageism is institutionalized. It's culturally ingrained. According to the World Health Organization, children as young as 4 years old become aware of their culture's age stereotypes. From that age onward, they internalize and use these stereotypes to guide their feelings and behaviors towards people of different ages. So, ageism includes negative attitudes, discriminatory practices, and institutionalized practices and policies by people of all ages against people who we think are too young and or who are too old. This reminds me of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with a very impressive 40-something-year-old female CEO of a large apparel brand that I'm quite certain you've heard of. She told me that when people ask her what she does, she of course tells them, I'm the CEO at the firm. Almost like clockwork, she tells me, they say, oh, you mean you're the CEO of the Canadian division? No, I'm the global CEO. Typically, that's followed by a moment of silence. But it's really not funny. Depending on these people, their response might be to be even more critical of her because of her young age. Men also experience ageism in terms of being too young. One of my good friends was promoted to the role of CEO of a big global company when he was in his 40s. He told me that he was conscious of the fact that many people believed he was too young. And we joked about putting white paint in his hair, so at least he looked like he had some gray hairs. So yes, ageism is real, even for the young folk. At the beginning of this episode, I shared a story where I was delivering a keynote to an audience of women in the financial industry when I mentioned my age. That was when I was on stage, right? After the keynote, I had the opportunity to sit down and talk with an ambitious middle manager who works in the corporate head office of a big bank. And this woman was noticeably attractive. She is undeniably pretty. She told me that she believes her appearance hinders her career progression. But she wasn't commenting on her attractiveness. No. She was commenting on the fact that she looks a lot younger than she really is. She constantly wonders whether she's being held back because people think she's too young. And she even brought this up with her manager. You might be thinking, "Aw, poor thing." But her concern is real, and it's shared by others. Last year, there was a fantastic article I read by Jessica Gross in the New York Times. She addressed this intersectionality between ageism and sexism. The article is aptly called "The Hour Between Babe and Hag." The title says it all, doesn't it? As a woman in the marketplace, you're either considered a young babe or an old hag, and there's only 1 hour between the two. The author of this article quotes social gerontologist Tetiana Shippey, who reports the following. She said, from ages 18 to 30, women report age discrimination due to being too young. And then from your mid-30s to your mid-40s, that's a safe time. Then age discrimination starts to pick up again after age 50, and it's especially high after 55 plus. Did you get that? From ages 18 to 30, we're too young. From your mid-40s, 30s to 40s, it's relatively safe. Then discrimination starts to pick up again after age 50, and especially after age 55. Yikes, I'm in trouble. This is further compounded for women from racialized or underrepresented communities. Again, that lovely intersectionality term. Recent academic research also validates how ageism negatively impacts women more so than men. I've included links in the show notes to various articles, including one academic article that concludes that online images reinforce gender stereotypes that contribute to both ageism and sexism against women in particular. Another academic article confirmed the structural bias within healthcare that negatively impacts older female patients in particular. Even the United Nations weighs in here. The 2023-24 United Nations Human Development Report concluded that older women face compounded disadvantages relative to other groups based on ageism and sexism. That all said, there is ageism affecting men in the workplace too. For them, this ageism typically happens much later in their careers, not during their prime earning years. Phew, okay, so this is all so heavy. Male or female, young or old, it happens to everyone. If you're experiencing ageism in your career, I hope this information at least validates your experience. So far in this episode, we've defined ageism in terms of negative attitudes, discriminatory behaviors, and institutionalized policies and practices. Remember, think, do, say. And I've provided you with plenty of examples, and we've talked about how ageism interacts with sexism. The question then is, what to do about it, especially when you're the victim. This is where it gets good. You can take control. I've got some ideas for you for how you can deal with ageism. If you're concerned about age-based discrimination, my advice for you is threefold. Surprise, surprise, the power of three. Number one, a personal brand goes a long way here. When you introduce yourself with confidence and mention your unique strengths, you focus everyone's attention on the value that you provide. For example, you might highlight your specific experiences, your expertise, your credentials, your leadership style, and maybe even your recent successes. Make these the salient points. Without a strong personal brand and inspiring self-introduction, it's possible that people might think about you as that older woman or that old guy. If you've done the work to develop your personal brand and you've introduced yourself with confidence, highlighting your strengths and your passions and maybe even your superpower, suddenly people might be thinking about you as a senior banking executive with unparalleled people skills, or the senior HR executive with a proven track record of solving problems, big and small. So that's my first suggestion for you if you're experiencing ageism. Develop a strong, unique personal brand. My second suggestion in combating ageism is this: avoid providing details that allow people to do the math. As I'm saying this, I realize this one might get me in trouble. If you're proud of your age and you're not concerned about ageism, then just skip this one. Go ahead and tell them you graduated from high school in 1988. But do you remember Carla, who you heard from at the beginning of this episode talking about #digital ageism? Here she is again, talking about how filling in the application form for a new job as a 57-year-old has all the odds stacked against her.
We're also often asked to put when we went to school and our major. For those of us decades into our careers, that is generally irrelevant, but it sure gives the algorithm what they need to discredit us at the get-go.
Ugh, I feel your pain, Carla. So the question is this: do you have to include the years you graduated from college or the years that you were in your first job? I get asked this question all the time. My suggestion is this: if you're filling out a form where these questions are asked about years, then yes, of course, you need to include those dates. Otherwise, avoid providing details that allow people to do the math. This is about purposefully not reminding people of your age without compromising your authenticity. It's not that you're being untruthful here. Rather, you're choosing to not remind them that you, for example, graduated from university in the previous century. Let me give you a few examples of how this might work. Say you're at work and you're talking about your kids. You don't need to mention their ages, so you could be talking about your daughter as opposed to your 35-year-old daughter. You also don't need to highlight the decade when you grew up. So you could just say, when I was a teenager, as opposed to, back in the 70s when I was a teenager. No, don't do that. Also, you can omit the year when you earned your university degree. Most employers don't care what year you graduated. It's more about the credential. That said, they do want to see how many years you worked in various jobs. And of course, if you're filling out a form, you do need to include this information. Okay, on to the third and last suggestion for how to deal with ageism. We've covered focusing on other elements of your personal brand, and we've covered avoiding providing details that allow people to do the math. My third suggestion is this: sometimes calling out the elephant in the room can be a great strategy. This is a perfect example, by the way, of what I call controlling the narrative. Instead of avoiding the topic of your age, try addressing your age head on in a way that strategically controls your narrative. So, for example, you could say, my extensive experience over the decades provides me with a catalog of relevant case studies that I can draw on. Sounds good, right? Or you could say, I might be the only person in the room with gray hair, but I'm also the only person who's done this before. I have so many insights and experiences to share with the team. Or you could even say, I'm 54 and I'm still learning. Speaking of 54, that reminds me of a fantastic book that I read and that I strongly recommend, particularly if you're north of 50 years. It's called From Strength to Strength by Arthur C. Brooks. The subtitle of this book is Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Life. In this book, Brooks describes how many of us, including me, including him, focus over the years on ambition and productivity. Then, at some point, probably earlier than you think, you hit an inflection point in terms of your cognitive abilities. They call it cognitive decline. Brooks advocates jumping off of that productivity and ambition curve onto a new output focused on sharing your wisdom. When I read Brooks' prescription for happiness and success, I felt very validated. My career personally has evolved from being very ambitious and productive as a brand manager, then as an academic, and now I've shifted to a new track where I'm personally sharing my wisdom as a coach. So here's the question for you. How can you shift your focus to sharing your wisdom and expertise? This is valuable stuff. Before you reject Arthur Brooks' advice, because you think it might not be relevant for you, maybe because of your industry or your expertise, Consider what opportunities you may have in your current industry or in your current function where you can share your wisdom. I share this idea these days quite frequently with clients who work in various industries, and it's something to definitely consider. Again, I'll leave a link to the book, From Strength to Strength, in the show notes. And that is it for this episode. I hope these insights about ageism will encourage you to question your own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and certainly to call out others when they might be ageist. I also encourage you, if you're the victim of ageism, to consider my 3 suggestions. 1, develop a strong personal brand. Focus people's attention on your strengths, not on your age. 2, avoid reminding people of your age. Unless you're filling out a form that explicitly asks for years and dates, you don't need to prompt people to do the math to figure out how old you are. And number 3, sometimes calling out the elephant in the room can be a smart strategy. Reference your age and control the narrative. Turn your experience into a positive. All right, if you enjoyed this episode, I do hope you'll share it with your friends, young and old, who might also benefit from some insights about ageism. You could also leave me a review on whatever podcast app you're using. These reviews make a big difference in the podcast algorithm, and I appreciate it very much. Don't forget to check out the recently relaunched talkabouttalk.com website and to sign up for my free communication coaching newsletter. Thanks again, and talk soon.